no man. Persian or Greek, no man threatens a messenger. This is blasphemy. This is madness.
Madness. This is
Reckless. The Font of Thunder is a heist exclusive unique shield which can only be looted rarely from the end reward room of Grand Heist blueprints. This shield has seen some use in the past, especially in regards to its chance to be shocked modifier, which can be used for self-shock mechanics, such as proccing galvanic field on your character rather than on an enemy. The other interesting part about this shield, of course, is the damage taken as component, which makes 40% of cold and fire damage be taken as lightning damage instead. And this is not specific to hit, so it works for all damage over time as well. However, the problem with this modifier has always been that it's 40% instead of 50%, because the shield can be combined with the timeless keystone Divine Flesh, which makes 50% of all elemental damage that you take be taken as chaos damage instead, resulting in a total 90% of cold and fire damage taken as either lightning or chaos damage instead. And you may be thinking, well, it's only 10% of the damage remaining, that can't be too bad, but the problem here is that you don't want to invest into any cold or fire resistance anymore, since that kind of defeats the object of using these mechanics. And yet, with 10% of the damage still being taken as those types, you're still going to be taking a lot of damage from that 10% if your cold and fire resistances are sitting at minus 60%. Ultimately then, because of that, these mechanics simply weren't used together all that often. However, in patch 3.25, this particular interaction receives some giant buffs, and that's the topic of today's video. In the Settlers of Kalguur League, physical damage taken as modifiers were heavily nerfed across the board, with many of those modifiers being outright removed or changed to do something else. One of those that were changed is the while affected by Purity Auras modifiers on Watcher's Eye jewels. Previously, these modifiers made a percentage of physical hit damage be taken as elemental instead, based on the type of Purity Aura that you were using. For example, physical hits taken as fire when using Purity of Fire. But in 3.25, those modifiers now make a percentage of the other two elemental damage types be taken as the element associated with the Purity Aura that you're using. And the really important point here is that they're no longer specific to hit damage, but rather all damage, including damage over time. So the modifier for Purity of Lightning is now 10% to 20% of fire and cold damage taken as lightning damage while affected by Purity of Lightning. This is finally the missing piece of the puzzle for the Font of Thunder and Divine Flesh tech to be able to take all of the incoming fire and cold damage as either lightning or chaos damage instead. However, there is something very important that needs to be noted here. Damage taken as mechanics do not function in the same way as damage conversion. That is to say that taking more than 100% of a damage type as other damage types will not be scaled down to 100% like it is if you have over 100% damage conversion. In other words, if you have modifiers which exceed 100% damage taken as, you'll effectively be taking more damage than the originating portion of damage. This is because all modifiers to damage taken as are calculated at the same step of the receiving damage calculation, and therefore you'll want to have exactly 100% or as close to 100% as possible. So, in the case of the Font of Thunder, Divine Flesh and the Watcher's Eye modifier, the only one here which has a roll range is the one on the Watcher's Eye. And this is one of the only cases you'll ever find in Path of Exile where you actually want to divine this modifier down to its lowest number roll range of 10%, or as close to it as you possibly can get. It's not going to matter too much if you're taking an extra 1 or 2% of the originating fire or cold damage, but an extra 10% is a lot, so you want to be as close to the 10% mark as possible. And once you have that, the setup is good to go. You're now taking 100% of cold and fire damage as either lightning or chaos damage instead, and that means you no longer need to invest into any cold or fire resistance. Now, the crazy thing about this setup is that the change to the Watcher's Eye Purity of Lightning modifier wasn't the only buff, because maximum resistances were made a lot easier to obtain due to modifiers now being accessible on regular jewels. You can roll up to 2% to maximum lightning resistance on Viridian, Cobalt and Crimson Jewels. But be aware that the easiest one to roll this on is the Cobalt or Blue Jewels because it has a higher weight compared to the other two resistance types. The existence of this modifier on Jewels is kind of crazy because together with Purity of Lightning and some aura effects, you're going to be able to reach 90% lightning resistance fairly easily, and you can even get a further 2% on the Searing Exarch implicit on your helmet if you're struggling for jewel slots. Now, there's a whole bunch of synergies you can utilise with this setup, and a lot of them revolve around the body armour slot, so let's take a look at those first. You can make use of the Doppelganger's Guise, which is a Maven exclusive body armour. This one has a roll which can go up to 40% less chaos and physical damage taken while sane. You're considered to be sane all of the time unless you toggle the skill to go insane, so this modifier is really effective with the aforementioned setup because it acts as another mitigation layer for any incoming damage type. It's good to shore up your defenses against physical damage, while 50% of all the incoming elemental damage you take is taken as chaos damage due to Divine Flesh, and that portion of damage will also be mitigated by this modifier. There's also the fourth vow, which is going to provide a more extreme level of mitigation for chaos damage once you have a decent amount of armor, but unlike the Doppelganger's Guise, this chaos damage reduction from armor only applies to hits. While we're discussing the body armor slot and armor application, I should also mention the Juggernaut's Unbreakable Ascendancy Notable, which was significantly changed in 3.25 to now apply 15% of armor to chaos damage taken from hits rather than any elemental damage reduction. This is very useful in this setup due to Divine Flesh. And of course, another body armor option you can look at is the Lightning Coil to make 50% of physical hit damage be taken as lightning damage instead, to massively improve physical damage mitigation. You'll also be wanting to use the Eldritch implicit on helmets if you're not using a unique helmet, for physical damage taken as lightning or chaos to further improve your mitigation against physical hits. Now, the body armor slot isn't the only one which has some effective synergies with this setup, because there's also Replica Nebulus. Unlike the normal Nebulus Scepter, this one provides damage based on missing resistances below your maximum resistance, and it provides increased fire and cold damage instead of cold and lightning. This is ideal for this setup since you're not going to be investing into any fire or cold resistance, so naturally just equipping this item with this setup, you'll already be able to reach the cap on increased damage for each modifier, for a total of 300% increased cold damage and 300% increased fire damage. With Replica Nebulus, just like with normal Nebulus, you'll be wanting to make use of a damage conversion setup, either cold to fire or more ideally physical to cold to fire, so that you can then also make use of Phys as extra damage modifiers. I did a full Forgotten Uniques video covering Replica Nebulus, which I'll link in the video description below if you're interested. One thing to be aware of is that you will want to solve shock in this kind of setup because of that chance to be shocked modifier on the Font of Thunder. Non-damaging ailments are based on damage taken rather than the originating damage of a hit, so because of this modifier, any incoming elemental hits will have an inherent chance to shock you, which is not ideal unless you want to use that interaction for some self-shock mechanics, otherwise acquiring shock immunity is a good idea. There's also Energy Shield. Obviously the shield itself grants a sizable chunk of Energy Shield, but since you're using Divine Flesh, your Energy Shield no longer retains its original function of absorbing damage. The ideal use case here is Eldritch Battery, to be able to solve skill costs, but if you can't reach Eldritch Battery, or if skill costs aren't a problem, you could instead make use of the Energy Shield Mastery for 10% less physical damage taken while on full Energy Shield, since your Energy Shield will always be full due to the fact that all damage bypasses it from Divine Flesh. Lastly, I'll mention one of the strongest parts of this setup, which is the ability to avoid damage type specific penetration either wholly or partially. Since the build takes no fire or cold damage, fire or cold type specific penetration cannot apply as that portion of the damage is no longer taken as those types. So this setup would easily be able to tank Uber Shaper Balls, for example, which have 40% cold penetration. Half of the cold damage is taken as chaos, while the other half is taken as lightning, and therefore all of the penetration is avoided. This is the same for the Uber Maven's Fireball, which has a large amount of fire penetration, and once again, all of the penetration would be avoided, as half is taken as chaos and the other half is taken as lightning. These types of abilities are significantly less scary once penetration has been factored out of the equation. For any lightning damage specific penetration, you'd be able to avoid penetration on the half of the damage which is being taken as chaos damage instead due to Divine Flesh. And that's about it. I wanted to highlight this combination of mechanics because it's an actually serviceable setup now, far more so than it was before, and I think it can make for some fun builds. I know there's already a few people using this right now, mostly with Doppelganger's Guise in combination with Forbidden Rite, which is awesome to see. Thanks for watching this video, and thank you for your ongoing support. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.